June 5th, 1944. An airfield in England. The sun sets on a scene of impossible scale. As far as the eye can see, thousands of young men check their gear, their faces painted, their hearts pounding. Beside them, stretching into the twilight, sits an air force of civilian airliners. 1,067 of them, lined up wingtip to wingtip. They are slow, they are unarmed, they are unpressurized. By 1944 standards, they are already obsolete, and they are about to become the single most important aircraft of the Second World War. This is the story of a machine that was never designed to be a weapon. It was a flying truck, a biscuit bomber, an old, slow flying bus. Its pilots weren't glamorous fighter aces. Its fuselage wasn't covered in kill markings. But this plane, more than any other, is how the Allies won. When General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was asked to name the most important tools of Allied victory, his answer was precise. He named 4: the bazooka, the jeep, the atomic bomb, and the Douglas C-47 Skytrain. Why? How did this boring transport plane earn a spot next to the weapon that ended the world? To find the answer, we must go back to a time of peace and a revolutionary idea that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with capitalism. The early 1930s. The aviation industry is in its infancy, and it has a dirty secret. It's a financial disaster. Flying is cold, it is terrifyingly loud, and it is dangerously unreliable. Airlines don't make money flying people. They are propped up entirely by government airmail contracts. It's a hobby for the rich, subsidized by the post office. The dominant aircraft are machines like the Ford Trimotor and the Fokker F.7. They are boxy, slow, and fragile. Then, in 1931, a TWA Fokker crashes, killing the legendary football coach Knute Rockne. The public is terrified. The industry needs something new, something safer, something profitable. The call goes out. Jack Fry, the head of TWA, writes a letter to 5 manufacturers. He needs a modern, all-metal monoplane. Most companies say it's impossible. One man, Donald Douglas, says maybe. His team creates the Douglas Commercial 1, or DC-1. It's a prototype. It's promising. It leads to the DC-2, which is better. It seats 14 passengers, and is a moderate success. But the revolution comes in 1935, not from TWA, but from its rival, American Airlines. Their president, C.R. Smith, has a different idea. He wants a sleeper plane for cross-country flights. He wants to put beds on a plane to compete with the Pullman rail cars. To fit the berths, the Douglas engineers have to take the DC-2 design and make it wider and more comfortable. They call the sleeper version the DST, Douglas Sleeper Transport. But then they create a dayplane version of this new, wider fuselage. By removing the beds and installing 21 seats, They create the Douglas Commercial 3, the DC-3. And with its birth, the world changes forever. The DC-3 was the first aircraft in history that could make money just by carrying passengers. It was reliable. Its two Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines were masterpieces of engineering. It was fast, cruising at 200 miles per hour. It was safe, able to fly on a single engine. By 1939, just 4 years after its first flight, 90% of the world's entire commercial air traffic was being flown by DC-3s. It didn't just join the airline industry, it created it. It was the icon of peacetime luxury and progress. But a storm was battering. In Europe and in the Pacific, the world was igniting, and this symbol of peace was about to be conscripted. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The United States is plunged into a global conflict, a war fought across 2 oceans and 3 continents. Very quickly, men like General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, realize a terrifying truth. This war will not be won by the side with the best fighters or the biggest bombs. It will be won by the side that can supply its armies. It will be a war of logistics. America needs to move millions of men, millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, blood plasma, and mail to the most remote and hostile places on Earth. They need a flying truck. And why invent one when the greatest transport plane in the world already exists? The order goes out. The DC-3 is drafted. The U.S. Army designates it the C-47 Skytrain. But it's not a simple name change. The C-47 is a brute, militarized version of its elegant civilian sister. The luxury seats are torn out, replaced by simple folding metal benches to fit 28 fully equipped soldiers. The small, polite passenger door is surgically removed. In its place, a massive 2-piece clamshell door is installed, a cargo door wide enough to swallow a jeep or a field artillery piece, with a smaller secondary door set within it specifically for paratroopers. The carpeted cabin floor is replaced by a reinforced metal deck, strong enough to handle tons of cargo. The engines are upgraded to the 1,200 horsepower R-1830 Twin Wasp, a radial engine so reliable it would become a legend. The British, who received thousands through Lend-Lease, give it their own name, the Dakota. But the men who flew it, who lived and died in it, gave it the most enduring nickname of all, the Gooney Bird. It was an ugly-sounding name for an ugly, unglamorous job, but it was a name given with pure, unadulterated affection. Over 10,000 C-47s would be built, rolling out of massive, mile-long factories in Santa Monica, Long Beach, and Oklahoma City. They were the most produced transport plane in history, and they would be sent immediately into every single theater of the war, where they would be asked to do the impossible. The C-47's first major test is Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Its first great test, and its first great tragedy, comes in July 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. It is the first large-scale airborne assault in Allied history. On the night of July 9th, C-47s dropped the 82nd Airborne behind enemy lines. It's a chaotic, scattered drop, but it's a success. 2 nights later, on July 11th, they fly a second mission, bringing in reinforcements. 144 C-47s carrying 2,000 paratroopers. But on the beaches below, the Allied fleet is on high alert. They have just been attacked by a wave of German bombers. Their gunners are terrified and trigger-happy. As the C-47s fly over the Allied ships, a nervous gunner on one ship opens fire. Then another, and another. In seconds, the night sky is filled with a web of tracer fire from over 3,000 Allied anti-aircraft guns. The C-47s are flying directly into their own defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Bill Yarborough, a paratrooper on one of the planes, described it as flying into hell. He wrote, "I could not believe what I was seeing. I watched helplessly as a C-47 on my left burst into flames and fell out of the sky." One of the pilots was Second Lieutenant George Mers. His plane, number 42-32922, was crippled by the friendly fire. He managed to ditch the aircraft in the sea. He and his crew miraculously survived. They were rescued by a U.S. Navy ship. But the horror was not over. Mers stood on the deck of that ship, a survivor, and was forced to watch as the rest of his squadron flew over. The ships around him opened fire. He was, in his own words, a helpless witness as the Navy shot down its own planes. When the sun rose, 23 of the 144 C-47s were gone. Over 300 men were killed or wounded by their own side. Operation Husky was a brutal, bloody lesson in the importance of communication, but it also proved the C-47's toughness, and the war had an even more impossible task waiting for it in the deadliest place on Earth. The China-Burma-India Theater. It is the forgotten front of World War II and the greatest logistical nightmare in history. In 1942, the Japanese capture Burma, cutting off the Burma Road, the last land-based supply route to the nationalist Chinese armies. If China falls, millions of Japanese troops will be free to fight Americans in the Pacific. China must be supplied. The only way in? Over the top. The route is from Assam, in eastern India, to Kunming, in China. The land in between? The Himalayas. The pilots call it simply the Hump. It is a 500-mile flight path over 20,000-foot mountains in the most violent weather on the planet. This is not a mission for the faint of heart. This is a mission for the Gooney Bird. The C-47s are loaded, often past their legal limits, with fuel, bombs, and beans. They take off from airfields just 100 feet above sea level and must immediately climb to altitudes their engines were never designed for. There are no reliable radio beacons, no radar. In the early days, pilots navigate by dead reckoning, or worse, by following the aluminum trail, a glittering path of wreckage from the hundreds of C-47s that had already crashed. The weather is a living monster. Pilots face 125 miles per hour crosswinds and, most terrifying of all, sudden catastrophic icing. A C-47 could pick up tons of ice on its wings in a matter of minutes, stalling the engines and sending it into an unrecoverable dive. Lieutenant J. Vineyard, a Hump pilot, wrote in his log, "The trip over was rough. We went on time and headings. On one leg I corrected for 125 miles per hour crosswind from the southwest. That turned out to be not enough, but we survived that. The Hump pilots live by a grim motto, a proclamation from their commander: the Hump is never closed. They fly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in all weather. The C-47 is a hero here. Its fixed landing gear can't retract, but that also means it can't freeze and jam. Its radial engines are air-cooled, and, though they gasp in the thin air, they work. For 3 years, the Gooney Birds are the only lifeline keeping China in the war, a bridge of aluminum built on the courage of its crews. But the plane's defining moment was yet to come. It would be back in Europe on the longest day. Operation Overlord, D-Day. The entire plan for the liberation of France hinges on one thing: that Allied paratroopers can seize the bridges and causeways behind the beaches before the main invasion force lands. If they fail, the men hitting Utah and Omaha beaches will be trapped and annihilated.
The job of delivering them falls to the C-47. On the night of June 5, 1944, over 1,000 Skytrains are assembled. Inside them, 13,000 men from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions sit knee to knee, a mix of bravado and silent prayer. They are flying low, just 700 feet, and slow, just 110 miles per hour, to ensure an accurate drop. They are, quite literally, sitting ducks. As they cross the French coast, the German flak opens up. The sky explodes. The paratroopers, who had trained for this moment for years, could only watch and wait for the green light. William Walton, a journalist who jumped with them, wrote, "I plunged out of the plane door, happy to be leaving a ship that was heading toward flak and more Germans." Kenneth Moore of the 101st recalled, "The plane started bucking and jumping, and as a fellow paratrooper fell down, the green light came on." The pilots, meanwhile, are fighting to hold their planes steady. They are flying through a solid wall of tracers and explosions. Ray Grossman of the 82nd said, "The pilot tipped the plane and put me and the first man in the stick on the floor. When we got straightened out and jumped, the first door load couldn't be found until noon the next day." Virgil Danforth, 101st, said, "As we stood in the door, our plane took a close one, which threw men down. I was wedged in this position, so I couldn't get up." Harold Canyon of the 82nd was in a plane that was hit and dying. "Just as I approached the door, the top of the aeroplane opened up. It had been hit. As I turned into the doorway, the plane started a right-wing dip, going into its death spiral. It took everything I had to get over the threshold. It seemed chest-high as I rolled over and got out. I was the last man out." Jack Schlegel, also of the 82nd, recalled that "I was the last to leave the plane. The plane was going down. I moved as fast as I could, and after bailing out, saw the plane go up in a ball of flame. The prop blast from the engines is so violent that it rips equipment from the men as they jump." Major Dick Rinters, made famous by Band of Brothers, recalled that the shock tore my leg bag off, along with virtually every bit of equipment I was carrying. D-Day is a success. The paratroopers seized their objectives, but it was the C-47 pilots, holding those obsolete airliners steady through a hurricane of fire, who made it possible.
The C-47's work in Europe is far from over. 3 months later, in Operation Market Garden, the audacious daylight attempt to seize bridges into Germany, C-47s drop thousands more. But the operation bogs down. British paratroopers are trapped at Arnhem. The C-47s are sent back in, this time on resupply missions, flying into a corridor of German anti-aircraft guns so dense it's called Flak Alley. One of those pilots is Second Lieutenant Herbert Schulman. His plane is hit. It's on fire. His crew is screaming at him to bail out, but he can see the drop zone. He refuses to leave. He holds the plane steady, drops his supplies to the men on the ground, and only then tries to save himself. It's too late. He crashes and is killed. Today, in a small Dutch cemetery, the propeller from his C-47 stands as a monument to his sacrifice. Then comes winter, the Battle of the Bulge. The German army makes one last desperate offensive, surrounding the 101st Airborne in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The 101st are out of ammo, out of food, and critically, out of medical supplies. They are freezing. They are dying. For days, a thick fog grounds the entire Allied Air Force. Then, on December 23rd, the fog breaks. A soldier from the 101st on the ground described it. First, he heard a faint drone. He looked up into the piercing blue, cold sky, and he saw them. Hundreds of them, a sky filled with C-47s, flanked by fighters, coming to save them. The men in the foxholes stood up and cheered, many weeping as a rain of colored parachutes delivered the supplies that would allow them to hold on. It was, they said, a Christmas miracle. But again, it came at a cost. The C-47s flew low and slow, directly over German lines. The first plane in the formation, piloted by First Lieutenant Robert Anstey, was hit and destroyed. The C-47 was a hero, but its heroes were not the glamorous aces. They were the truck drivers of the sky.
They were the men of the Air Transport Command, or ATC. Their job was not to fight, but to fly, endlessly. Robert E. Callahan was a C-47 radio operator. He wasn't a pilot or a navigator. He was an enlisted sergeant. He told a story that perfectly captures the unglamorous, high-stakes reality of the ATC. On a long ferry flight, his C-47 was flying between thick cloud layers, lost over the Atlantic. The navigator, a first lieutenant, was trying to use a sextant to get a sunshot, but couldn't see anything. Callahan, using his radio, was getting perfect position fixes from stations in France. He recalled, "I kept showing him what my fixes were showing, but he ignored me. He was a first lieutenant, and I was a sergeant. He was supposed to know where we were." Hours passed. The crew grew nervous. Finally, the clouds cleared, and the coast of Ireland was directly below them. They were hundreds of miles off course, blown by winds the navigator had missed. A frantic calculation. Do they have enough fuel to make it to their base in England? Callahan, quickly it was decided we just might be able to make it. Every fuel-saving effort possible was followed. We were on the very last tanks when the coast came into view. The needles were sitting on 0 when the wheels of our plane touched the runway. A great shout went up throughout the plane. This was the C-47's war.
not dogfights and bomb runs. It was a daily war against weather, distance, mechanical failure, and human error. They were the artery. They carried the blood plasma that saved lives in the Pacific, the mail that kept up morale, the bullets that armed the infantry, and the fuel that kept the bombers flying. By 1945, the war is over. The C-47 has proven itself. It has earned its retirement. But the Gooney Bird was just getting started. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockades West Berlin, attempting to starve the city into submission. The C-47 is called back to duty. It forms the backbone of the Berlin airlift. Day and night, C-47s, along with the larger C-54s, fly into Tempelhof Airport, carrying coal and food. They become known as the Rosinen bomber, the Raisin bombers. The Gooney Bird, a weapon of war, becomes a symbol of hope. It saves the very city it had been bombing just 4 years earlier. And its combat career is still not over. It flies in Korea, and then 20 years after it was deemed obsolete in World War II, it arrives in Vietnam. This time, it gets an upgrade that will make it one of the most terrifying aircraft ever created. In 1964, an experiment. Take an old C-47 and mount 3 side-firing 7.62mm miniguns in the cargo bay. Each gun can fire 6,000 rounds per minute. The pilot would bank the plane in a tight circle, called a pylon turn, and unleash a torrent of fire so dense it was like a red liquid laser. They call it the AC-47, attack cargo. Its call sign is spooky, but the troops on the ground, the men it saved time and time again, call it Puff the Magic Dragon. On its very first mission, defending a Special Forces camp at Trong Yen, a crewman said, "We opened fire, and it scared me half to death. I thought the guns had blown up." The AC-47 could orbit a besieged outpost for hours, providing a wall of lead that the enemy simply could not cross. The bravery of its crews was legendary. At the Ah Shau Special Forces camp, an AC-47 was forced to fly below 400 feet to engage the enemy. It was hit by .5 caliber fire and crashed. The co-pilot, Delbert Peterson, survived, then charged an enemy machine gun with his M16, suppressing it long enough for a rescue helicopter to save the rest of his crew. And then there is Airman John Levitow. On a spooky gunship, his plane was struck by a mortar, which exploded in the cargo bay. The blast wounded Levitow 40 times. Through the smoke he saw an armed magnesium flare, which had been knocked loose, rolling among thousands of rounds of live ammunition. Bleeding profusely, unable to walk, he dragged himself across the tilting, shrapnel-filled floor, threw his body on top of the burning 2,700-degree flare, and hurled it out the open cargo door, just milliseconds before it detonated. He saved the entire crew. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor. The C-47, a 1930s airliner, was still producing heroes in 1969.
After Vietnam, the C-47 finally retired from military service. Thousands of surplus planes flooded the civilian market. And just as they had in 1935, they created the post-war commercial aviation industry. They became the workhorses for new airlines all over the globe. And here is the most incredible fact of all. They are still flying, right now, today. In the jungles of Africa, the mountains of South America, and the ice fields of the Arctic, the DC-3 and C-47 are still working. Why? Because in 80 years no one has built anything that can do what it does better. It can land on a dirt strip. It can be fixed with a hammer. It can be overloaded, battered, and flown into the worst conditions imaginable, and it will always bring its crew home. So we go back to Eisenhower's quote. Why did this plane rank with the atom bomb? Because the bomb was a single event that ended the war. The C-47 was the daily, grinding, unglamorous process that won it. It was not a weapon. It was the artery that carried the lifeblood of freedom. It was the truck, the ambulance, the lifeline, and the angel of mercy. It was never the fastest, the prettiest, or the strongest, but it was and is the single most important, significant, and indestructible aircraft that ever took to the sky.